specialist, one might say. And as the first one is the most difficult, after that answers come much more quickly, but you might have a correct answer, you might not, and it's not always so obvious. Generally, I found it very obvious. And usually...
Is there a single answer, or...?
Good question. Is there a single answer, for example, to the sound of one hand clapping? Well, there are many ways of expressing it, but yes, there is basically, and it boils down to, is there a Zen insight? Yes, there is. Next question. Yes, ma'am.
Who organizes the public festivals, and how are they...
Who organizes public festivals, and how are they paid for? Different groups organize them. Festivals are frequently in the domain of the Shinto, and they are neighborhood affairs on a smaller level. And I have, in my neighborhood, there are strictly the neighbors that get together and do that. In larger cities, like in Kyoto, where they have the very large festival, that is, I mean, the city government is never involved in that. They block off the streets, and of course that requires cooperation on a very large scale. And people in general pay for those. That's from religious donations. Shintoism, of course, is what is called a religious corporation. This is, and they're tax-free. Their donations are not taxed. I also am not taxed because I am a religious corporation of one.
Do you participate in these public festivals?
Yes, I do in my neighborhood. Sometimes they're fun. I at least have to make an appearance. I don't put on my robe. I just show up and, hi, how you doing? And people try to get me drunk as usual, and then I depart as fast as possible in many cases. Some of them can be a lot of fun, especially with the dancing. That can be kind of fun. It's interesting to see, but I am obliged to go show my face. Yes, sir.
Zen Buddhism is becoming very popular in the States. How close does it reflect Japanese Zen Buddhism?
Okay, Zen Buddhism is becoming very popular in the West. How closely does it resemble Japanese Buddhism? It's very, very different. It also has a lot of basis in theology, or studying, reading books, exchanging opinions, and so on. In the monastery where I trained in, nobody had time for books. We didn't have time to read books, and very few of the monks engaged in what might be called religious conversations. We were too tired, and that sort of dialogue, religious dialogue or intellectual activity, is not emphasized in the monastery. In fact, it is in large part rejected. Piety has no place in a Zen monastery. Zen monasteries are based on a feudalistic system that goes back at least 1,000 years. It's a very, in Japan, it's very military as well. Military feudalistic system, which makes it so hard for Westerners to tolerate. It's very hard for me to tolerate. I do, but I'm used to it to a certain extent. I learned how to, what can I say? It's not going to change, and I'm not going to change it. So I don't really see myself as Mr. Black Ship coming in to open up the Buddhist market or to change it in any way. Western activity, in a way, Zen activity is, in a way, very similar to the way Zen developed in China, where people were very much on their own and set up their own practices or their own training centers, which later developed, as time went by, later developed into monasteries or established training centers. And the other thing that they have in the West is there is no money to be made from religion, at least from Zen, unless you're a writer or a lecturer. People that practice Zen in America, in a way, are a very pure form, but they don't attain the training level is much easier. Now, according to each person's opinion, one is better or the other than the other. In fact, there are now Zen monasteries in Japan which are not official training centers, but they have sort of a compromise between the West and the East, a fairly difficult training schedule, but none of this, certainly what is going on in the West, I've been involved with a little bit, very little actually, of the training centers in the West, but none of them would compare to the difficulty, the level of difficulty or the level of seriousness, at least in terms of the physical schedule that goes on in Japan. There's a very brutal schedule going on here, and it's more of a discipline here. It's a discipline there, but it's more of by there I mean in the United States, it's more of a spiritual venture or adventure or seeking. Here it's just more of a very hardcore, brutal military dictatorship that just happens to be dealing or based upon Zen. Yes?
Could you describe some of that training? You mentioned it's difficult physically.
Yes.
So,
let's see, a brief schedule or a brief definition perhaps of a typical day in the monastery. Usually most Zen monasteries in Japan, the monks will get up at 3 or 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and very little nourishment in the way of food. Monks are always hungry. I remember that. And in the winter, monks are always cold. My worst memories of the monastery are being brutally cold, and colder than I thought it was possible for a human being to endure, actually. No heat, no hot water, no heat sources, no privacy, no free time, a diet that never changes, which is basically for breakfast it's rice gruel, for lunch it's rice and miso soup, bean paste or bean curd soup. Same thing for dinner. Dinner is leftovers from lunch, and the breakfast is just the boiled rice that is left over from dinner. Of course, you don't have time to dine, shall I say. Usually you wolf it down as fast as you can. All pleasure is sucked out of life, and that includes dining or lounging or whatever people do. Everything that could possibly be enjoyed is taken out of life in a Zen monastery. No privacy, no free time, no time, barely time to eat your food. It's all based upon working on your koan or meditation. And that can be the very hard work schedules as well, and some chanting, but that's considered just an extension of meditation. The entire focus is based upon meditation.
the work schedule?
Work schedule would be working in gardens and vegetable gardens, keeping the temple grounds clean, and also all buildings are wiped clean at least twice a day. I mean thoroughly wiped clean at an incredibly fast pace. Everything is like clockwork, and it's a very fast clock you're operating on, and a very old clock. It goes back 1,000 years, and a very mean clock. Very few foreigners survive in the Japanese monasteries. Yes,
What
ma'am?
is your goal and objective for this regimen? Your own salvation, your own enlightenment, or are you doing this for others, or what? And then you say there's no feeling or belief in afterlife. Why would a group of people or anyone do this?
Why do people do this? Well, in Japan now, since the Meiji Restoration, people now are basically forced to do it. 90 to 95% of them. If your father is a priest, then, and you are the eldest son, it is your duty to take over his position. If the eldest son rejects that, and there's a younger son, then the next son is obliged to take over the family enterprise. Family enterprise being the temple. That has historically been in Japan for almost any occupation, and nowadays, since about 150 years ago, when Zen priests were allowed to start getting married, the eldest son, it was the duty of the eldest son to take over the family temple. Therefore, most people, most Japanese people in Zen monasteries